And I looked up the horse. So the horse comes from the 12th century, much later, that there's going to be kind of artistic depictions of this event by going into the Renaissance, and that's where the horse comes from. So there's really nothing before that, and then in the art, it's really the art world trying to make this a dramatic scene where you get a horse added in.
So it's the visual tradition that adds the horse.
Yes.
Yeah, and I just now I almost said horse, and then I reminded myself that there's no horse in there. He gets knocked down, and he has this flash of a moment where he's changed, and he hears the voice of God saying, "Why are you persecuting me?" So we'll start by getting back to this passage in Acts, and I'll read this, and then we'll talk for a little bit about a topic that was of great interest last time, these different ways of imagining the Christian life. So let's get back to Acts, so we'll read this part here, Acts 9:19-31. This is right after the dramatic moment in Saul's life. He stayed some days with the disciples in Damascus, and he began at once to proclaim Jesus in the synagogues, that he is the Son of God. All who heard him were astounded and said, "Is not this the man who in Jerusalem ravaged those who call upon this name and came here expressly to take them back in chains to the chief priests?" But Saul grew all the stronger and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus, proving that this is the Messiah. After a long time had passed, they conspired to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. Now they were keeping watch on the gates day and night so as to kill him. But his disciples took him one night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. When he arrived in Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he was a disciple. Then Barnabas took charge of him and brought him to the apostles, and he reported to them how on the way he had seen the Lord, and that he had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had spoken out boldly in the name of Jesus. He moved about freely with them in Jerusalem and spoke out boldly in the name of the Lord. He also spoke and debated with the Hellenists, but they tried to kill him. And when the brothers learned of this, they took him down to Caesarea and sent him on his way to Tarsus. The church throughout all Judea, Galilee, and Samaria was at peace. It was being built up and walked in the fear of the Lord, and with the consolation of the Holy Spirit, it grew in numbers. Okay, so people are very suspicious of him because they know who he is. They've seen him. He persecuted them. He was one of the most dedicated they weren't Christians yet, but he was against this movement. We talked last time about why that would be, right? This movement of Christians is a threat to Judaism. They have an entirely different way of understanding what this covenant would be. And he wants to stop that. And so he's gone from one thing to another. He's completely changed. He's done an about face. So we have in this, and we were talking about this last time, this conversion story as one of the models for the Christian life. I'm walking this path, and I turn, I'm changed, I'm a completely new person, and I'm walking a different path. You wouldn't even recognize me from the person I was before. And some of you in here, we were talking at our tables, could relate to that. That's how you have felt in your life. Without Christianity, I wouldn't be who I am. I'm completely transformed by this commitment. And that idea of being born again is essential in some ways to the Christian narrative. But it doesn't have to be. There's another model too, and I talked about this last time, and I called it, gave it a name, the viator. So another model of the Christian life is that of a traveler, right? A viator who's walking a path, right? We're not like this, and then all of a sudden this thing happens, and you're walking a different path. That's Paul. That's the conversion. But the viator is just, you start out, right? And if you're a Catholic, you get baptized as a little baby before you even know what's going on. So people are carrying you on your path in the beginning. It's not even your choice. For some people, it's this baptism. For a Protestant or someone born again, baptism marks this moment of conversion. But for Catholics, you're baptized as a little baby, and you're just traveling along life. You've got your low points, you've got your high points, you've got moments where, you're closer to God and farther to God, and hopefully are getting closer and closer to God as your life goes on. And so that these are two models. And I would say we have, sort of these models in Peter and Paul too, right? So Peter's there, he's called from the beginning, and he follows Jesus. He's got some low points when he denies him, denies he's ever known him. He's got some higher points where he realizes who he is and has come back to it, but he's traveling the path. Paul's got this other road. He's persecuting Christians. He's against this movement. He's happy to see them killed, brought back in chains, and then something happens and you wouldn't even recognize him. So I just think it's interesting to see these two models, and we kind of finished with that last time. So we wanted to see if there were any other reflections that people had about that. Have you noticed those? Did you think about that during the week? Did you have any comments about those two different things? Does that make sense to you? Just wanted to see if there were any other things people wanted to say about that. Yeah, hi.
Are those that the only two models that are sort of supplied? Like, what would you, let's say somebody grew up most of their life and just didn't know Jesus, didn't know God, and then gradually sort of became aware and their life changed. Would they fall into that viator because it was this gradual sort of thing once they were introduced? Or does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, Heidi's question is, are these the only two models? I would say no, right? I mean, you can be sort of in this, born into it and not really paying attention much, not knowing much, and then, you can have some experiences that feel really transformative along the way. So I think they can be combined. Those are two poles, and Peter and Paul represent the two poles, but I think that, there's a combination that's possible as well, and that's a good question.
And to kind of go on with that, like the Billy Graham model, which is a very Protestant model, is, okay, you have this moment. It's kind of pushes everyone into the conversion. There's a moment when you go forward, when you make this big decision. And I think that's the dominant one in a lot of ways in the US, but there would be other ways to imagine a kind of gradual, like becoming more interested in spiritual things, is something like that.
But there's, like you were talking about, your father definitely was in that model as well.
Right.
He heard this thing on the radio, and all of a sudden that was it for him. He was a new person after that.
Yeah.
He was converted. And I mentioned that I was interviewing for a job at a Christian college, and they asked me, what's your conversion story? I was like, I don't really have one. Like, my parents got me baptized when I was 6 weeks old, and I've just sort of been walking and thinking about this ever since, and I was able to say, it's interesting you would ask me that, because I was being interviewed for a Catholic studies position, and I was able to say, this is a very Catholic way of being Christian, doesn't necessarily include this type of transformative conversion. But it can, but it doesn't have to.
John.
Some denominations will emphasize that born again, that personal relationship with God. And I think it is, as I think about it, I think maybe every human being either has a personal relationship with God or not, or that human being has rejected that invitation. But it is very personal.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it be Beator or like Paul or whatever, I know my relationship with God, and each one of us does, and it's very unique. And we are also unique, and He knows us better than we know ourselves. So that personal thing, I think, as long as as long as we agree with the Bible as the Holy Spirit reveals it to us and guides us, and our commitment is complete, I think we're brothers and sisters.
Yes, and I take that to heart, this kind of uniqueness of different callings. And I think that's kind of where the upshot of some of what Karen's saying is that we cannot sometimes adopt one model of conversion as the only one. And then Karen, I think, is proposing that it is a very unique personal thing and it can look different ways. And, there can be this altar call born again version, which is you have to have that kind of crystallizing moment. And what we have instead, and I think if we all shared, we'd have we have a lot of different stories about how that happened. Yeah.
Looking at Acts and looking at your illustration there, about how much time did it take for Paul to have this conversion?
Yes.
Length of time.
Right. So that's a really important question here, and that's why we're going to go to Galatians and talk about Galatians, because this is going to be Paul's description of his conversion, and it's going to be some surprising points in comparison to Acts. If you read Acts, it all seems to happen bang, bang, bang. That he has this conversion, then he's taken in by Ananias, and he kind of comes to see the truth, and then he's out preaching basically the next day. And then he goes to Jerusalem, and he meets Peter, and they're like, okay, you're one of us now. But what Luke isn't showing is that there's actually a lot of time differential in this whole thing, that Luke is kind of compressing. He's not saying it didn't happen, but if you read carefully, you can kind of bring these things together, but there's more time than you would think in what is happening here. Also, at the end of this passage that Karen just read, his life is being threatened. When the brothers learned of this, they took him down to Caesarea and sent him on his way to Tarsus. That's his home in what is today Turkey. And now there's about 10 to 14 years between sending Paul off and then his first missionary trip in Acts. But Luke never tells us. Put a decade in here. But there's a lot of time that's built into this. So what looks at first to Acts like, okay, he's quickly coming around, is there's actually there's years in some cases in between as Paul is working things through. And that's another thing that I think is in this conversation of time, and it's like there wasn't a crystallization and he's done, but he has to think about it, meditate, ponder, have guidance. Kevin. Mm-hmm.
People that we have coming in are off the streets, they can't be anywhere else. They're dealing with mental illness, We're supposed to be very careful about praying and talking about our faith with them. But over the last week and a half, gotten to know some of these a little bit better, and we've been praying together. They're at that point when you're showing they're at the bottom. They're not hopeless. There's still some faith there, but I think with what they're dealing with, they just don't know. And it keeps coming back for me to Acts, and you want to do things for them, and the thing that we have to do with them is just walk with them. We can't try to change them because they're dealing with things that won't change unless something happens. But I never felt I was strong enough in my faith even to try to pray with someone. And the moments that you do it, they'll break down in tears and just cry. It leads to other parts of conversation. So there are just those moments, right, when you expect that lightning or falling off the horse or whatever. It is a long period of time. I'm glad you mentioned that. It stretches out over time. You just have to be there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so walking on that path with the person, maybe there isn't going to be a lightning strike for them. Maybe it's just those daily steps and walking with another person. Yeah, and I do think that there's this big range, and then a big range over our lifetimes. If we're blessed enough to live long enough, we're going to see these different things. So yeah, thank you for that, Kevin.
I thought we'd move on to Galatians. We're kind of jumping out of Acts just for a second, but this is of interest because it's Paul talking about his own conversion.
Right.
So this is in a letter to Paul, by Paul, written to the Galatians, a church, and he is in.
Yeah, and he's describing his own conversion, and you wanted to point out some important differences here.
Right. So I'm going to read this. I'll say just a word and then we'll have you talk about this at your table. But the thing to be listening for here is what is surprising about this description? What is the emphasis that Paul wants to make out of his conversion? You'll notice that there is no voice from heaven, but there is a revelation of Jesus that he makes reference to. The years are going to be different, and it kind of takes a little bit of work to kind of harmonize this with Acts. Although I do think it can be done. But his overall emphasis. Also, remember in Acts, Paul was immediately taken in by Ananias. Here, he wants to make the point that no, it was just me. I was figuring this out. So I'm going to read this. Think about what is surprising about this version or striking to you about this version of Paul's conversion, and we'll have you talk at your tables. Now, so this is Galatians. This is Paul writing probably 25 years before the composition of the book of Acts. This is one of the earliest pieces from the New Testament. I want you to know, brothers, that the gospel preached by me is not of human origin, for I did not receive it from a human being, nor was I taught it, but it came through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you heard of my former way of life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it, and progressed in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my race, since I was even more a zealot for my ancestral traditions. But when God, who from my mother's womb had set me apart and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, so that I might proclaim him to the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. Rather, I went into Arabia and then returned to Damascus. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to confer with Cephas, that's Peter, and remained with him for 15 days. But I did not see any other of the apostles, only James, the brother of the Lord. As to what I'm writing to you, behold, before God, I'm not lying. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was unknown personally to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only kept hearing that the one who was once persecuting us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. So they glorified God because of me. So talk among yourselves. What do you see there? What strikes you about what Paul wants to describe with his own account of his conversion? What maybe surprises you, either because it's there or because it's left out? Right.
Like there's a gap between
Is it really hot in here? I'm like sweating.
Okay. What do you see there in this version of the of Paul's conversion?
What's he trying to be sure that we emphasize, or what confused you, if you don't know, whatever comments you have about this, questions, comments, observations.
Bob?
Well, one thing that caught me was that, I didn't pick this up from these other folks. This was a revelation to me, and I figured this all out on my own. That seems to be a little presumptuous.
Right.
Yeah. Paul is still the same person in some ways, right, that he was. He's quite sure of himself and quite confident, whether he's Saul or Paul. And yes, he wants to say, this is me. Don't think that I got this from somebody else. I got this directly to myself from God.
And
Yeah,
Luke,
presumptuous.
I mean, I don't think they're necessarily contradictory, but Luke wants to say immediately Paul is taken in by Ananias. And he's struck blind, he's helpless, he's led into Damascus, Ananias lays hands on him. That's a different note than we get here from Paul himself. He has an argument he's trying to make, but there's a more dependence in Acts, whereas Paul is really emphasizing, with God, I figured this out.
Yeah, and you'd think if you were struck blind, you might mention that. I mean, but he doesn't mention that. Like, that would be something I would remember. Remember the time when God struck me blind for 3 days and I was helpless and this other person helped me? It's not in here.
Well, you do have a flair for the dramatic.
Do I? But he's definitely wants to say, this was me, and this happened to me, and I was chosen from my mother's womb for this. So,
Yeah.
Steve.
Paul experienced the event, but now it's been a while since he's telling this in this story, his own story. This is after his journey program. So what would he want to emphasize? We want to emphasize what happened over the life of the journey up to then. Would he remember or think it was so important that this incident occurred, or that it's been quite a journey?
Great.
So, he tells this much later. I don't want to believe that Luke was a liar.
No.
We're not saying that.
No. And I
Different
think
emphasis, like you're saying.
That's one of the conclusions somebody could make. But I don't believe that. And I guess the one gap that bothers me is 3 years to get to Jerusalem. Well, maybe it was Saul. Maybe Luke is just advancing the thing.
that's right. And if you'll notice,
Repeat what he said.
yeah, so
The other thing is, Luke is trying to summarize this event and tell the story of Paul. And it's possible that this is one of those times when two different people are telling the story two different ways. And where did Luke get the story? Maybe from Paul, maybe from someone else, but maybe it's a little bit of like the campfire thing. You go around the campfire and pass the word along. By the time you get to the end, it's a little different.
yes. So Steve, just to summarize for the camera, I think this is a really important point. Steve is talking about some of that. These do seem on the surface like somewhat different versions of the event, and how to reconcile those. And you're specifically talking about some of the time issues. So two things to mention, like if you look closely at Luke's version, like in 9:23, it says, Paul is preaching in Damascus, and then Luke says, after a long time had passed, the Jews conspired to kill him. And I think we read that and think after a long time had passed, month, 2 months, right? But if you read in the Galatians, it's after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to confer. So long time it's being condensed here, and that's going to be a matter of years in actuality. So the Galatians account helps us kind of say, yes, Luke is compressing this into a tight story, and then these timelines are longer than we assume as we're reading it. That's one thing that we get out of Galatians. And then also what you're saying about the story of the conversion, Paul's already visited the Galatians. They probably already heard the long story, because we get it 3 times in Acts, right? So to some extent, what's happening is he wants to bring out something specific, which is, I had a special revelation, and I learned this. I wasn't taught this gospel, but I got it directly from God. I have a kind of apostolic calling and authority. That's what he wants to emphasize, and he's not going into the whole conversion narrative. The structure.
Especially if you've heard the story before, you don't need the same details every time. You're going to have a different emphasis. So I think that's another way of thinking about it. Yes.
It just dawned on me, here's Paul with all this education, and he's been educated in the Jewish faith through a lot of leaders, and he's got all this knowledge, and he's thinking one way. This conversion comes, and it's Christ. Now after that, isn't it possible that he all of a sudden starts to review what he learned and goes, oh, I see now that this was all predicted, and this could have come to him gradually.
Yes. And, that's when he says, nor did I go up to Jerusalem. To those who were apostles before me, I went into Arabia and then returned to Damascus, and after 3 years. So he appears to have had this long study and meditation time that was part of this. You wouldn't get that from Luke, but when he's telling his own story, there were years of kind of, what does this mean? How do I understand, the scriptures in light of this revelation and so he's emphasizing the time. He's emphasizing it was special revelation. I wasn't given this by anybody else. And number 2, it took me a long time to kind of get my head around what happened.
He has to reconcile his old knowledge with his new knowledge.
Yes, that took basically a course of study.
Yeah.
Does
Bob.
this correspond at all to the Desert Fathers period, or did they come after?
After.
It came after this.
He didn't go there to study with them.
No. And the desert, like the Arabia, there are these cities out there. And I was reading a commentary, and they were talking about this specifically, is that this doesn't seem to be a desert retreat. It seems to be more, he's kind of going out to these cities in Arabia, what we think of today as Jordan, and staying there in those areas as he's kind of working things out. Yes?
In my Bible, there's a little preface to it. It says Paul is writing this letter to refute Pharisees that Jerusalem had sent to speak against Paul, and who had to be circumcised, follow the Judaism way of life. But he wants to convince the people that he's just the messenger. He had this revelation, and he was telling you the truth, but this is the word of God. God is. So he's trying to kind of tread lightly and not criticize the Pharisees over much to create a big controversy.
Right. So he's going to be telling them, and we're going to see this in the next couple of chapters of Acts. So this is how do you make this transition from Christianity as something that's a subset of Judaism to it's now a religion for all people? That's the transition we're about to make. And Paul is one of the people making that argument, and he has to say, I have authority. I didn't know Jesus. Unlike Peter, I can't talk about having traveled and known Jesus and been a part of that early ministry, but I had this revelation from God, and that's what that's what gives me this authority to tell you what I'm about to tell you.
Yeah, and that's actually, historically, those are the two different models for religious authority to be passed on. You can have a person who's been there from the beginning, who knows the leader inside and out, who's their right-hand man, and then they become the successor. That's Peter. Or you could have a person who maybe hasn't been there in that same way, but has this divine choice. And so that's been chosen by God. And so we see that in other religious traditions as well, including Islam, Sharia, Sunni, and Shia, yeah. Islam have those different models of who's going to succeed after Muhammad. Is it the person who is the closest to him, who follows the rules, who knows him the best, or is it somebody who's coming through a divine choice? We see this over and over in religion, and so we see this there as well. Another thing about Galatians, if you read the rest of Galatians, it's really a fascinating book. I would say go back to it, because that is exactly what Paul is trying to do. He's trying to say, how do we, how do we reconcile this? And he ends up a little bit later in Galatians talking about the choice of when God tells Abraham, your people will be more numerous than the stars in the sky. He actually says, at that time, God meant us, the Christians. So he's sort of taking all of Jewish history and saying it led to this moment. That's an incredible move. You can see a new tradition, a new faith being born in that moment, and thinking about his mind and how he came to that is all very interesting. So I would say Galatians is a key book in the New Testament that goes along with Acts, and it's worth going back to if your mind is thinking about these things after today.
And we'll probably come back to Galatians.
Yeah.
I'm looking here at Galatia, which is the country, I'll call country.
Region.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed that in all three times that Paul goes on his journey, he always goes back to this place called Antioch. And Antioch, so I asked myself, what was in Antioch that drew him to go there three times, according to what I read and see? Is there something about the place that you have these experiences, that you have this closer relationship to God? Is that what is also that there's certain places?
I would say, what?
Antioch is mentioned
Right.
over and over.
Yeah, I think I lost.
I need new batteries.
Okay, let me try this. We'll just switch off with the mic. Antioch, the overall plot of Acts, Jerusalem, then to Judea and Samaria, and with the Philip, the deacon, we were in Samaria at that point, and then on to the ends of the earth. And so we're going to be kind of expanding geographically. And Antioch is going to be a major city. It's part of Turkey today. It was destroyed, almost completely destroyed by an earthquake. So you don't, it's not, it doesn't have much in terms of remains, and it's really gone. It's not a big city anymore. But it was at this point a huge center. So that's going to be a major city, and it's kind of the halfway house between expanding out of Jerusalem, and then eventually we're going to end Acts in Rome. So it's part of this, I would see it's part of this kind of expansion plot that will eventually land us in Rome. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth, start with Antioch, a major city, and then move out to Rome by the end.
They must have had a certain culture there, a certain environment that Paul felt as if he could.
Yes, and those will often be based on, there's a big Jewish population. So if there's a big Jewish population, that's where he's going to be drawn to.
Okay.
There. Okay, good. We're back.
There we go. All right, should we move on?
Yeah, let's
with Acts?
move. Let's move on.
Okay, so now we're moving on with Acts, and we're going to be talking about Peter here. So as Martyn said at the beginning, as we have at St. Mary's and in many other churches throughout the world, these two characters, Peter and Paul, are coming together here. So see if, as you listen to this, if you hear echoes of things that we may have read in the past in this group. So just listen carefully. As Peter was passing through every region, he went down to the holy ones living in Lydda. There he found a man named Aeneas, who had been confined to bed for 8 years, for he was paralyzed. Peter said to him, "Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and make your bed." He got up at once. And all the inhabitants of Lydda and Sharon saw him, and they turned to the Lord. Now in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas. She was completely occupied with good deeds and almsgiving. Now during those days she fell sick and died. So after washing her, they laid her out in a room upstairs. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, hearing that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them. When he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs where all the widows came to him weeping and showing him the tunics and cloaks that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter sent them all out and knelt down and prayed. Then he turned to her body and said, "Tabitha, rise up." She opened her eyes, saw Peter, and sat up. He gave her his hand and raised her up, and when he had called the holy ones and the widows, he presented her alive. This became known all over Joppa, and many came to believe in the Lord. And he stayed a long time in Joppa with Simon, a tanner. Whoa.
I did a few years ago actually have a student named Dorcas, and I thought, okay, there's a brave New Testament name choice.
Back to the name choices. So give it a few minutes. What did Gary says, whoa, maybe we haven't read this passage in a while. Maybe we haven't encountered this in church or in our readings. How did it make you feel to hear that? What do you notice? And did it sound like other things? Just take a minute to talk at your table about that.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are we talking about this passage with Peter, Tabitha, and all of this incident here? What struck you or surprised you or sounded familiar to you? What seemed important here? Yes, Dad.
Yeah, we thought, heal maybe, but raise from the dead, that's a Jesus act. You know, I wouldn't think they'd expect a follower to have those extreme miracle powers.
Yeah, and so you're asking, would this have been expected? Yeah, what do you think?
I mean, it seems like this is about as extreme as it seems like a miracle that Jesus would do. We do have Peter saying, Aeneas, Jesus Christ heals you. So this is being done not as Peter saying, this is me or my power, but through Jesus Christ. But this sounds like we're in the world of the Gospels still with pretty extreme miracles, even someone being raised from the dead.
Yeah, it sounds like the little girl who's raised from the dead in Mark that we read about. Remember her? And so it reminds me of that. And maybe not quite to Lazarus. Lazarus with the 4 days, that one seems, in a different category in some ways, always to me. But for the little girl, Jairus' daughter, this reminds me of Jairus' daughter that we read about in Mark. Yeah.
A question and an observation. I don't recall if Paul ever, if there's any stories of Paul being involved with a miracle. I don't think so. I'm not absolutely sure. Then second, an observation. This raises Peter to a new level above Paul, in my mind. It suddenly emphasizes this was a great story about Paul, and he was a great man, but Peter, he's got something more.
Yeah, well, I completely agree. That Luke is wanting to say, okay, we just had this story about Paul, dramatic, but let's remember we got Peter back here. And how those two relate to each other is, I think, like this is a transitional story to get Peter back into the mix. And he's about to do something really important in the next chapter with Cornelius. So that's definitely what's happening. And we are being reminded that of the importance of Peter. I do believe we'll see miracles from Paul. When we're going to, Acts will be where we'll see that in the next few chapters. But Peter, we don't have a model where it's like Peter's in Jerusalem, Paul's doing all the fun stuff outside. Here is going to be Peter beginning to take the gospel to Gentiles and still is this central figure in the church. I saw a hand. John?
I think sometimes the more accurate view of how what's happening is God's doing it through them.
Yes.
It's not them doing it as human beings. It's their surrendering to God and obeying God and then God moving through. Actually, like Kevin did with the homeless. He showed them God's love. He allowed God to work through them, and they experienced God's love. And that's what I believe moves people. That's my personal.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the Holy Spirit is moving through them. It looks a lot like what we get in the Gospels, but it's the continuing presence of Jesus through the Holy Spirit in this early church. That seems to be Sheila.
So as I was kind of reflecting on this, Peter didn't just go in and say, get up. He prayed first. And Jesus also always prayed. So, there's the following that, Peter was doing what Jesus does, that
Yeah.
praying first. That's the only way it's going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. Peter sent them all out, knelt down and prayed. Like you're saying, he turned to her body and said, Tabitha, rise up. And that story that Karen, the Jairus daughter, Jesus says in Aramaic, Talitha cum. So Tabitha, it's a very similar, a lot of these features are similar. But Jesus is praying to the Father. But it's a very similar kind of pattern that we get in the gospel miracles.
Any other comments about this? a surprising amount of power here. And I think it is your point is well taken. I think there is a tension between Peter and Paul, a dynamic tension, not a, critical tension. But, and here we see, it isn't just that Peter has all the power and Paul, both of them have this divine connection to God and to Jesus, and are working through that. I don't know what's going on back there, but.
And then the other thing I want to say is Dorcas. She's occupied with good deeds and almsgiving. So here's a woman, and then she's praised for her works. And you'll notice that she is, the widows are weeping, showing him the tunics and cloaks that Dorcas had made while she was with him. So this is taking us back to those early points about the church, about giving to the poor, helping the poor, that is something that Dorcas is doing, and why she's praised here. Let's move on to the last part. I think we're not going to be able to fully discuss this, but this is, I think, the most central part that we're getting to here is the mission to the Gentiles. And this, for us, may seem like, of course, I mean, the church goes to everybody, it goes around the world, but this is a real defining point for the church, is how is this faith that begins and comes out of Judaism and is a subset of Judaism, how is it going to switch over and be a worldwide and global religion? And that's what Luke is trying to get at here. And it's going to begin with Peter's vision, and we're going to have to do something about the Jewish legal laws, about food, about circumcision, about all these different areas. So this is our first step into trying to understand how the church is going to make this leap out of Judaism into something that's different. Now, this is Acts 10, 1 through 16. Now in Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of the cohort called the Italica, a devout and God-fearing, along with his whole household. He used to give alms generously to the Jewish people and pray to God constantly. One afternoon, about 3 o'clock, he saw plainly in a vision an angel of God come into him and say to him, "Cornelius." He looked intently at him and, seized with fear, said, "What is it, sir?" He said to him, "Your prayers and almsgiving have ascended as a memorial offering before God. Now, send some men to Joppa and summon one Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying with another Simon, a tanner, who has a house by the sea." When the angel who spoke to him had left, he called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier from his staff, explained everything to them, and sent them to Joppa. The next day, while they were on their way and nearing the city, Peter went up to the roof terrace to pray at about noontime. He was hungry and wished to eat, and while they were making preparations, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven opened and something resembling a large sheet coming down, lowered to the ground by its 4 corners. In it were all the earth's 4-legged animals and reptiles and the birds of the sky. A voice said to him, "Get up, Peter, slaughter and eat." But Peter said, "Certainly not, sir, for never have I eaten anything profane and unclean." The voice spoke to him again a second time. "What God has made clean, you are not to call profane." This happened 3 times, and then the object was taken up into the sky. All right.
Wow.
The sheet, the miracle sheet that comes.
It's like a menu coming down from heaven, like, here's all the things.
I was thinking, okay, well, maybe we should lead with a picture of the sheet coming down. And it was kind of funny because there's all these artistic versions of lobsters and lions and vultures. What was all on this sheet is.
So there have been artistic artists trying
Well, mostly modern
Yeah.
versions of it for children's books and stuff. But it was funny to see all the animals included.
Yeah. So here, we have this devout follower of Jewish food laws, Peter. He's hungry. It's time for lunch. He goes up to pray, and he's never eaten anything unclean in his life. And he's getting a message on a sheet with all kinds of animals on it. So very dramatic representation of this change that's going to come. You're not going to have to be following these strict dietary laws in order to be a follower of Jesus, which is a huge issue for this thing.
And if you're to think about it, what does separate Christianity and Judaism? These food laws, the kosher food laws, and this is really continues to be something at the center of. There's a number of things, but food differences in food laws strictly adhered to within Judaism, within a lot of Judaism, and then here a kind of loosening and opening of any kind of food regulation. So as people become Christians, like this Cornelius, which is what we're going to be looking at next week, you're not going to, he's a Roman centurion, devout and God-fearing, along with his whole household, used to give alms generously to the Jewish people and pray to God constantly. So here's kind of a perfect test case. He's completely a Gentile, he's not Jewish, but he has this kind of piety and respect for the monotheism of Judaism, and he's drawn to it, but he's not going to be circumcised. He's not going to follow the food regulations and dietary laws of the Jews, even as he's drawn to this form of spirituality. That's the person that Christianity is going to kind of be able to take in and say, you don't need to do all these things. That is, Cornelius can just become a Christian and maintain these and not follow these Jewish regulations.
Yeah, so it's a major innovation here. So we're out of time. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next week.
More Cornelius. Thank you.